Hello.
Hi again. We were into Luke 18, 1-8 last time, doing the immediate context of the woman whose perseverance in prayer even impressed the unrighteous judge. And we were trying to explain why Luke 18:8 is such a problematic verse for so many of us, when Christ asks, when the Son of Man arrives or comes back, will he find the faith on the earth? Mm-hmm. And we anticipated verses 20 and 21 of the previous chapter have something to do with this.
Right. So I'll reread them just to refresh us. But on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God was coming, he answered them and said, "The kingdom of God is not coming with striking observableness. Neither will people be saying, 'See, here,' or 'there.' For look, the kingdom of God is in your midst."
In the New American Standard, verse 20, B part says, "The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed."
So I think that would be a problem for Jehovah's Witnesses. Because you think it's going to be noticed by the signs. That's what's going to make everybody aware. That's going to be aware.
So the kingdom comes, the signs are there to signify the king is here.
And their own translation says it's not coming with striking observableness.
So the king was there. The kingdom of God is in your midst. The king was there when these words were spoken, but there were no signs. And this is anticipating and being anticipated by the words that come after, which if you go on to verse 22 through 24, you realize he's making a contrast between two takes on what is happening.
Okay. Then he said to the disciples, "Days will come when you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. And people will say to you, 'See there,' or 'See here.' Do not go out or chase after them. For even as the lightning, by its flashing, shines from one part under heaven to another part under heaven, so the Son of Man will be."
So he anticipates here that there'll come a time when disciples will get discouraged, even disappointed that they're not seeing the days of the Son of Man.
Right.
And you can sense that just by reading some of the epistles in the New Testament. That there's, in Thessalonians, for instance, Paul is already dealing in the 50s, 20 years after Christ's ascension, with the discouragement of people dying and not thinking this would happen.
Because you know that when Jesus was there, they didn't get it. They didn't understand who he was. It took them a long time to get that. Then they're expecting he's going to bring the kingdom right now. Mm-hmm. Everything's going to happen. So you can almost foresee that they're going to get discouraged along the way, because they're always second guessing or thinking, what does this mean? Just like we do.
Yes.
We second guess, we think we understand when we don't understand. But I think this thing about there are going to be people saying, "See there, see here." Don't go after them. Don't chase after them.
We're more familiar with that from Matthew, right? Where it's quite explicit who this is.
Right. False prophets.
False messiahs and false prophets.
Say that. And that's exactly what the cults, including the witnesses, do. Mm-hmm. They say, look at all the signs. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians too get preoccupied with things that are happening in the world and think they're signs that we're in the last days.
Now, Luke apparently wrote this and the book of Acts in the 60s, the latest in the 70s. Okay. And the destruction of Jerusalem hasn't happened yet. So there's a lot of things that they're anticipating within a generation. Sounds familiar.
Right.
But haven't happened yet. So he's also the only one who records this saying, "The kingdom of God is in your midst." So perhaps it's a reminiscence of someone about something Jesus said that that people or disciples read too much into. When he said the kingdom of God is in your midst, well, wouldn't you anticipate if you heard Jesus say that? Something's immediately going to break out here.
Yeah.
But it hasn't, and now another 30 or 40 years has gone by. So you can understand the discouragement and the disappointment of many disciples, but he says, don't be fooled by those who come and say, well, maybe you misunderstood. Maybe the Jewish understanding was that some of these prophets were messiahs. Some of the false messiahs, according to Josephus, showed up before the destruction of Jerusalem.
And because the Messiah is written about as both conquering, basically, and as suffering.
Yeah.
So because there's this dual quality about the Messiah, and they're favoring the conquering part and not the suffering part, there's all kinds of things built into this that would cause you to be discouraged.
Sure. And there's two other factors. If you compare this with the Matthew account, because parts of it are very similar. In the Matthew account, you have the additional factor of the increasing of lawlessness, he says. The love of the greater number will cool. Well, how does that fit with great preaching in the last days, and the truth will be evident and everybody will hear about it? The love of the greater number will cool. Well, it's linked in Matthew with the false prophets and false messiahs. A discouragement kicks in, maybe because the prophecies don't work out either way. That's part of it. And also, we want to parallel that with Hebrews, which is written around the same time as Luke writes this. And Hebrews also is anticipating the fall of Judaism, but it hasn't happened yet. And in the book of Hebrews, the central point is an apostasy, a falling away of Jews back into Judaism. So you can understand how, if Luke is writing in a similar context, a big problem is already happening. There's a general cooling off of love towards the expectations of Judaism. People are getting discouraged, both Jews and Jewish Christians, and maybe Gentile Christians too, according to Thessalonians. So the rest of the chapter anticipates what and maybe describes what the normal thing is that's causing them to be so discouraged. So why don't we read from 25 to the end?
To the end or to 30? We talked about.
To 30.
Okay. First, however, he must undergo many sufferings and be rejected by this generation. Moreover, just as it occurred in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, men were marrying, and women were being given in marriage, until that day when Noah entered into the ark, and the flood arrived and destroyed them all. Likewise, just as it occurred in the days of Lot, they were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot came out of Sodom, it rained fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed them all. The same way it will be on that day when the Son of Man is to be revealed.
So the one thing he wants to stress in these reminiscences from the Old Testament is the suddenness of his appearing, his coming. Signs, no signs. No signs. Life goes on normally. And don't you think that would be a discouragement? As it is right now for many Jehovah's Witnesses. Life has been normal when they didn't expect it to be normal.
Yeah.
For a long time. So the early Christians, only 30 years, 40 years in, would have been suffering from a similar malaise or a disappointment that the things we expected are not turning out the way we expected them. Let us read the rest, 31 to 37.
On that day let the person that is on the housetop, but whose movable things are in the house, not come down to pick these up. And the person out in the field, let him likewise not return to the things behind. Remember the wife of Lot. Whoever seeks to keep his soul safe for himself will lose it, but whoever loses it will preserve it alive. I tell you, in that night 2 men will be in one bed, and one will be taken along, but the other will be abandoned. There will be 2 women grinding at the same mill. The one will be taken along, but the other will be abandoned. So in response they said to him, Where, Lord? He said to them, Where the body is, there also the eagles will be gathered together.
So you can see that where everything seems to be normal, decade after decade, discouragement easily kicks in. And I would say dependence also easily kicks in. So that it's very easy to get so distracted by your normal life and the need to compete like people do in normal life in the economic marketplace that you start to hand off your faith to others. So the prevalence of the cults, the false messiahs and false prophets in the last days is quite easily understood if you combine with that the idea that people will be so preoccupied with the normal things of life that they will lose their passion for faith and for religion.
Yeah.
That first love that Revelation talks about.
When we talked about verse 23 before, before we did the video, we talked about the fact that when they say see here and see there, there's a kick in of delusion, really, of people buying into a delusion or a deception, and that's very characteristic of the cults too. That they do this very thing. They distract you almost from what you should be doing by focusing on looking for signs. And
yeah. So is it any coincidence that in our Western world where the cults began, affluence has been so prevalent for the last 120, 150 years in the Western world, and America, of course, where most of the cults that we think of as cults began, affluence has also been a character of their culture for so long. It's very easy for Christians just to fade into a mild form of Christianity. So maybe in the next segment we'll link the prevalence of lawlessness in the general culture with the disappointment of Christians because it's taking so long for the Lord to come, and especially the passion that this next story, the story of the woman's perseverance in prayer, that passion for Christ and the things of God that Christ seems to anticipate will be lacking when he actually arrives. And tie it to the next segment, which is in the segment in Luke 18:9 to 14. You might want to meditate upon that before our next discussion. The two men who go up to pray. What two types of religion do we have here?
Yeah,
in that story.
Particular passage meant a lot to me when I was in the process of leaving the witnesses.
The next segment, Luke 18:9 to 14.